I hope you all had a good break and a good lunch. I must congratulate Decaf on their selection of little nibbles, but that's quite enough for a midday break as we discuss an important topic. Don't want to fall asleep afternoon. I know a lot of people had to leave to catch a plane or another rendezvous. But I'm glad some of you are still here and dedicated followers of this important issue that we're dealing with here, or trying to deal with. We keep talking about the national referral mechanism. I have here in my hands a copy of the NRM, and you can get your copies outside on the table. And that's why we're here. We're here to update this handbook, to find ways, new ways, innovative ways, to tackle human trafficking for forced labor. I saw a film the other day, a feature film. I was telling friends, everyone I spoke to today, it was by pure coincidence. It was not planned. I didn't know what it was about. It turned out to be about human trafficking, the worst form of human trafficking and sexual exploitation of women. Bars turned into brothels in Bosnia. It was heart-wrenching. The degrading practices that these people go through are put through by traffickers. Torture, humiliation, death if they don't comply. And what's worst of all is that it happens in a peacekeeping mission by peacekeepers. And I stand here as a proud member of the United Nations family who is ashamed of what goes on in some of these missions. And I can't tell you how important this is. The name of the film, by the way, and I urge those of you who have not seen it to see it. It's a wake-up call, another wake-up call. I think it was produced about 10 years ago. The Whistleblower. The Whistleblower. I know it's been shown actually at the Palais des Nations, so I was behind the times, I guess, and didn't see it until 2 days ago. Coincidentally, as I was preparing for this panel discussion, The Whistleblower with Raquel Weiss and Vanessa Redgrave. Raquel Weiss is the American policewoman who goes to Bosnia and ends up investigating these crimes against humanity perpetrated by her own colleagues, and they try to stop her. Governments, authority tries to stop her from publishing her reports. I won't tell you the ending if you haven't seen it, but it is really worth viewing. Vanessa Redgrave plays the role of the representative of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Bosnia, and she does a very, very good job. Anyway, that's enough of my ranting. We're here to find new and innovative ways. And of course, the primary responsibility for addressing trafficking in human beings lies with states. But no one actor can tackle this multifaceted, complex issue on their own. Member states need the help of international organizations, of national organizations, non-governmental organizations, civil society, and business. That's why these 5 people are here, 4 gentlemen and 1 lady. I'm glad we have at least some gender balance. Not entirely. Some of the other panels were more, well, I won't go into that now. So, of course, this includes the private sector. Business is a big player. And for business, trafficking is especially evident in their supply chain. So we'll be asking them about that now. Different recruitment and employment agencies and multiple layers of subcontractors involved in supply present a challenge for accountability. And businesses in tourism, for example, and transport might be unknowingly aiding and abetting travelers. So this last panel will focus on how the private sector fits into this issue that we're talking about and trying to resolve. And again, I'm going to urge speakers to stick to the topic no long political statements or historical statements of what we did in the past and how wonderful we are. It's how wonderful we want to be in tackling this problem. I'd like to start with Nick Groner. Where are you, Nick? Hi. Yes, yes. You look like your photo. It's always a good thing. Not a plastic. Can we unmute the books? Voila. 1, 2, 3. Here we are. So, Nick, thank you for being with us. You're from the Freedom Fund, which works with frontline community organizations in countries with a high prevalence of forced labor. So from your perspective, why is it important for business to be a part of the solution? Do you agree that business should be part of the solution?
Look, absolutely. Business needs to be part of the solution because business is very much part of the problem. We find with modern commerce these days, it depends on extended supply chains crossing continents to source cheap goods and cheap labour. And of course, by far the cheapest form of labour is forced labour. And situations where workers are not paid or they're paid next to nothing and their labour is extracted through violence or other forms of coercion. And migrants are particularly vulnerable to such coercion because often they're not protected by the law of the country they're in. They're desperate, they're willing to take risks that others wouldn't take in environments where some kind of job can be the difference between life and death for them and their families. So we have a real issue around forced labour in these kinds of countries finding its way into supply chains. And just a couple of quick examples. When we're talking about the crisis in the Middle East and the massive refugee challenges resulting from the conflict in Syria, if you go to somewhere like Lebanon with an unbelievable refugee burden, I was out there earlier this year, went out to the Bekaa Valley, where the scenario is that extremely young children are forced to work as a coping mechanism, if you call it that, because their parents don't have the right to work and will be arrested if they try to. So in this camp, I was seeing 6 and 7-year-old kids, a 6-year-old boy who is telling me that he's going to go every afternoon and work in an auto repair shop operating electrical equipment, 6 years old. And a girl who is representative of many, who every afternoon is going and picking potatoes, 7 years old. Now imagine a young girl picking a sack full of potatoes. At one level it sounds pretty innocuous. At another level, when you visualize what this involves for a young child, it's pretty horrendous. In Lebanon, it's not so much transnational supply chains, but then you go across the border to somewhere like Turkey, and we've already heard from the previous panel about issues of children working in factories, often in hazardous circumstances. The whole issue of children in situations in agriculture, in the fields, working in hazardous situations is certainly something that we see often when it comes to migrants. I was in Thailand over August, went down to the port down in the south there, Songkhla. All of us will have heard, and we are munching on prawns here. I didn't ask of the origin of the prawns at lunchtime, but all of us will have heard about issues of slavery in the Thai seafood supply chain, on the fishing boats, in the prawn processing sheds. These are migrants from Myanmar or from Cambodia who were tricked or deceived onto boats and then forced to work extremely long hours in very, very difficult circumstances. I met one group who had just come off a boat. The youngest person on that boat was 13 years old, been at sea for 18 months, subject to horrendous exploitation. And then the last example we read a lot about these days is migrants from Nepal or from India, South Asia, coming to Qatar or elsewhere in the Middle East in the construction industry, often passports withheld, operating in a situation of bondage. This is how it makes its way into supply chains. That's a brief illustration of the issue. In terms of the solutions, I'm going to talk briefly about why businesses should be focused on this, and I know Phil will be talking about how business much more practically can be focused. So, I've got 3 propositions on why business should be focused. The first is that it's increasingly going to be in corporate's interest to be focused on this problem. There's been an explosion of investigative journalism into these issues. You can read it every single day. The Guardian's doing magnificent work, the New York Times, BBC, Thomson Reuters, Al Jazeera, Deutsche Welle. And so there are stories all the time that we're reading, often consumer focused, but why the goods that we use, the services that we use are being supported by forced labour. We're also, as a result, seeing a lot more litigation. There's a case right now against the suppliers of Walmart over their seafood supply chain. There was a case in the US recently where 4 Indian workers who were in forced labour in America, came out from India, received awards of $14 million against the engineering company that then went bust. So the first proposition is that it's increasingly in companies' interest to pay attention. The second is that the regulatory environment is changing. We have seen legislation in California requiring corporates to do more about declaring what they're doing on forced labour. And the UK Modern Slavery Act now has provisions for companies to put out statements on their policies on forced labour and supply chains. And I know Phil will talk more about that. But so you've got increased transparency requirements directly related to slavery and forced labour. And then the third proposition is that the wider, as you engage corporates, there's a wider regulatory environment that actually really matters. And suddenly corporates and their compliance people are becoming aware of this. So the Bribery Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, if you're a bank, your Know Your Client provisions or your anti-money laundering, right? When you have Nepali workers coming from Nepal to Qatar, bribes are paid all the way through the process to get the permits, to get the health certificates, to exit immigration. And when you get to the other end in Qatar, bribes are paid at the other end for the contracts to be approved, for the residency permits. So whether or not you as a corporate care about slavery, we say you should, but even if you don't, you should care about bribery because that can lead to direct criminal responsibility for senior management. Right? So you should be focused on this wider regulatory environment around issues of trafficking and forced labour. So we see a virtuous circle going on here. Greater awareness, greater investigations, more litigation, more regulation focused on this leads to more awareness, more investigation, and we hope a spiral of good practice. So what does it mean for corporates? It's not easy. If you have an extended supply chain, I'm not going to pretend this is easy. If you're a multinational corporation that sources cotton or sources your minerals for your mobile phones from the Congo, it's not easy because essentially we're talking about the beginnings of a change of philosophy. Where in the past, with an extended supply chain, 3, 4, 5, 6 tiers, we're talking about shifting risk to those right down the bottom of the supply chain where you have maximum flexibility to extract labour, you can do so at the minimum cost, and all the risk, or most of the risk, is transferred to those down the supply chain. What we're saying is, in this regulatory environment, there will be a shift of responsibility. There needs to be a rebalancing of this risk. It needs to come back to the corporates at the end of the supply chain. But that's not easy. It means longer-term contracts with your supplier, not saying we'll switch from month to a different supplier to get the cheapest cost. If you want your supplier to put in good conditions in the workplace, you actually have to build a longer-term relationship with them. Right? So we're seeing corporates that are doing this, ranging from Unilever and IKEA, that are extending their reach much more deeply into their supply chains because they understand that they have to do it. So I think we're going to see more of this. In the end, the case, of course, for this is not the economic case. It's fundamentally a moral case. And you only have to see, as we do, working on the front lines of young children and others being exploited to understand that it's critically important to make these changes. I'm based in London. I think often about the abolitionist case. The abolitionists 200 years ago working to abolish the slave trade that was then legal in every country around the world. Economies depended on the slave trade for tobacco, for cotton, for sugar. And there was a band of activists that in the space of 20 years managed to get the slave trade legally banned. And I think that we're now looking at how do we progress so that we can kind of carry forward this mission and change so that our globalized economy, which we're hearing so much about now, and those being left behind, well, the ones that are really being left behind are the most vulnerable and the most marginalized at the very bottom of the supply chain. So if we're really talking about a rebalancing of this, I think it's critically important that we engage with corporates to fundamentally realign some of these interests. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is my microphone on? Yes. Thank you very much, Nick. I apologize for not introducing all of you before you started, but of course all the names and titles are on the screen, and we want to gain time and save a lot of time for discussion. You were going very, very fast, Nick, and I was trying to encapsulate what you said, and it's all very, very relevant, and rebalancing the risk and bribery levels and increased transparency. But I hope that somehow during the discussion we can sum that all up succinctly towards the end. Phil, let me pause for a minute and ask how many businesses are in the room. If there is a business entity in the room, please raise your hand. Well, I know there's one sitting in the second row, and she has refused to raise her hand. But isn't it astonishing that this event has not attracted more businesses? Does that say anything to us? That's just a question I'm throwing up in the air. And I'm very glad that we have at least one business corporation, Philip Morris International, sitting right here in the person of Vitor Grencho. Vitor, welcome. But I'd like to ask Phil, who is, again, Business and Human Rights Resource Center, Executive Director. We've just heard Nick succinctly and eloquently outline some of the things that need to be done. You're benchmarking companies, aren't you, on these very issues? Can you say what lessons you've learned from your investigations regarding these benchmarks and the shift we need to see in business practices?
Yeah, very much. Firstly, there's an increasing realization that really pretty much every global supply chain that we have contains modern slavery and human trafficking within it. So there's really no business that can put hand on heart and say, we know there's no human trafficking involved in our products. The clothes in our wardrobes, the chickens on our plate, and the prawns, the hazelnuts in our chocolate bars, the metal paint in our cars, all these things we know have a significant risk of having modern slavery within them. And I think it's important just to, before I go into some of the solutions, just to say, you know, there is a sense out there that this issue is that this hyper-exploitation is really unchecked and unsupervised. And that's contributing to a loss of trust in the markets, and particularly global markets, and also to the companies and the investors that operate within those markets. It's also being exploited by the chauvinistic, narrow nationalism that's there. People saying, effectively, that markets are completely unfair. Anyway, globalization is unfair. Am I now supposed to compete with slaves in other countries? And so, again, I think, and therefore, let's put my country first. I'm not speaking about any particular politician here, but let's abandon globalism and go for nationalism. And so what we're discussing here is not unrelated to those broader concerns we have and that were discussed earlier today. But equally, the action that's taken is also part of the solution to those narrow nationalisms that are emerging in so many areas of the world. And so I think to demonstrate action, businesses, first of all, whole sectors of industry have to start following the leadership of companies in their own sectors. That's a small minority of companies that have made significant efforts to exclude modern slavery and human trafficking from their supply chains. The solutions here are not easy, as Nick said, but they're not rocket science either. First of all, companies have to abandon the failed model of effectively doing audits and insisting on compliance statements from suppliers. We know that has just led to a feast of deceit and dishonesty around what is happening in the supply chains. And therefore, too many companies are going into their global supply chains, doing first-tier announced audits. They say 6 weeks before they're going in, we'll be visiting this factory on X date, and surprise, surprise, they find nothing there. You know, just to give you one example of Turkey, we went to 30 of the fast fashion brands earlier this year and asked them about what they were doing to protect refugees paid half the minimum wage in those factories. Only 3 of them said that they'd been able to identify refugees in those factories. We went to Turkey, and within 2 days, and this was the day after the coup, within 2 days, even in those conditions, we found large numbers of refugees, large numbers of children in the factories that we know were supplying those same companies. So if we can find them, how come the companies can't, is the key question. No company wants modern slavery. I'm convinced of that. Nobody company wants modern slavery in their supply chain, but far too few of them are making the effort to really exclude it. So what can they do? They have to move from that failed model to a model of due diligence and collaboration between them. So due diligence in terms of really looking at where the high risk is in their supply chain, doing deep dive research, speaking to the people that they don't like speaking to, including trade unions, workers' organizations, refugee organizations. They know where the refugees are, they know where the human trafficked people are, they know where the migrants are being employed in appalling conditions. So they have to do that deep dive and identify that. Then they have to take remedial action, which we can go into in questions perhaps. And then critically, they have to do sector-wide collaboration. Sector-wide collaboration. So if you go down, most of the abuse is happening in the second and third tiers of their supply chain. For instance, fast fashion brands go to Turkey, they say, produce me 50,000 of this jumper. Of course, the company said, of course we'll do that, and you want it in 2 weeks' time? Oh, that's no problem. They're knowing full well that they can't deliver, but they need the contract so that they then go to second and third tier, and that's where all the, for instance, in Turkey, the refugees are employed. At the second and third tier, no one fast fashion brand has the leverage to be able to insist at the second and third tier that those refugees are got rid of. It's only when the whole of that industry gets together and sends a single message to the suppliers in Turkey, we will not tolerate this any further. At that point, when they collaborate, they get the leverage that's necessary to make the change. So how do we get this to happen? And that's where our benchmarking comes in and the efforts by many other organizations. Because we need to provide a rich reputation reward for the companies that are doing the right thing. And by also doing that, we need to provide serious reputation risks for the long list of laggard companies that are doing so very little on this. And unfortunately, the evidence from our benchmarks are that there is always in a supply chain a small number of companies that are doing the right thing, which people can learn from in terms of best practice, but there's very large number, the majority in any supply chain, in any one industry, that are really doing very little at all. To give you just one instance, the Modern Slavery Act that's just been passed and is now in force in the UK, we've now got 1,000 statements from that Modern Slavery Act, company statements. We analysed just the FTSE 100 companies, the largest companies. You'd expect them to be the most advanced, really putting the effort in to exclude. Half of them, first of all, could not even comply with the obligations of the Act, which is simply that you make a statement, you get the board to approve the statement, you get the director to sign the statement, and you have a link to that statement on the front page of on the home page of your website. Only half of them could even comply with that obligation, let alone the 6 suggested areas of due diligence that they were supposed to show. So it gives you an idea. That was Marks & Spencer's, SAB Miller. Those kind of companies have really shown that they can do things, and that other companies can learn from them. Another one we've done is with Know the Chain is on, say, food and beverage. On food and beverage, regarding, again, modern slavery and human trafficking, the average score on procurement was 1 out of 10. Was 1 out of 10. In terms of traceability, it was 4 out of 10. You know, you've got Unilever, Coke, and Nestle, 3 companies that were way ahead of the rest. And then you've got this long tail of a large number of very well-known brands that are doing virtually nothing to exclude it. So that's the way we think we need to do it, is to use the competitive market mechanisms to drive change, to provide a reputation reward for the leaders and some real reputation risk for the laggards. But that's a necessary but insufficient condition. The second key thing that has to happen is that states have to be far less timid on this than they have been in the future, than they have been in the past. Governments now have to build. Governments traditionally have gone, for the last 20 years, they've basically said to companies, we'd like to ask you for voluntary action on these issues. Well, voluntary action is not delivered, and we have to accept that. And so they need to build from that voluntary action, which has been shown to help leading companies. They need to now start to insist on some levels of regulatory action as well, so that there's mandatory due diligence. As with the Modern Slavery Act, so the UK's already done it, there's mandatory transparency. Yeah? You have to report. You may report that you've done nothing, but you have to at least report what you're doing.
I'm surprised, doesn't that exist already, mandatory transparency?
No, not at all. And the second thing that we need, but we can now learn from that. We've got the California Act, which we did the same thing, but just for Californian companies. We now have the UK Act, which is extraterritorial. So if you want to operate in the UK market, wherever your home is, if you want to operate in the market and your turnover is over £36 million, then you have to make that compliance statement. So, last week I was with 25 of the biggest Japanese companies who'd made a trip to London to find out what their obligations were because of that extraterritorial reach of the Act. The other area that we need I would argue, is in terms of this most egregious area of abuse in the global supply chains, we need to have mandatory due diligence. And again, there's a good example of this. We've got Obama have brought in the Trade Enforcement, Trade Facilitation Act, and what that says is the US Department of Labor has identified 135 products from particular places where there is a very high risk of slavery in the production. So if any importer is going to import those products from those places, the burden of evidence, the burden of proof, lies with the importer to demonstrate that they've not been produced by slaves, by people who've been human trafficked. So again, there's a clear way in which you can demonstrate that mandatory due diligence, which is also necessary at this stage, I think, in order to exclude it. The last area is really providing also incentives. Business loves incentives, so let's give them some incentives. Let's make sure that the public procurement that happens, which is of an enormous importance to many businesses, is only available to those that have demonstrated the due diligence on human trafficking and slavery. Let's make sure that the market, so if you want to tender for the United States goods under the Federal Acquisition Regulation, anti-trafficking provisions, you have to be able to demonstrate that you have done due diligence to exclude slavery from your supply chains. Otherwise, you can't bid for the product, for the services which the US government is seeking. Surely every government in the world should, having signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, make that a fundamental part of their tendering process. So those are three ways in which governments can do more. In terms of companies, we've got to make sure that there is a real reputation risk for those, a real reputation reward for the leaders, a real risk for the laggards. That can be done, I think, now, and I'll finish with this. The European Union could start to learn from those and create the highest common denominator, or a higher common denominator, combining what Obama's done with what Theresa May's done, with what Germany and the Dutch are also doing in their situations. We can use the German chairing of the G20. We've got the Italians chairing the G7. Those can also be pushing this agenda. We've got the Alliance 8.7, which could take these issues up. We've got the Global Compact, which is being led by the Swiss and the Mexicans. They could take this up. So my appeal is to let's reward the corporate leaders that are doing the right thing, and let's make sure that governments set a clear and common set of minimum standards on this. We were supposed to have achieved the abolition of slavery 150 years ago. It's time to finish that job.
Well said. Well said. Thank you very much. Phil. It all seems so obvious, doesn't it? And
easy for me to say.
Well, I'd like to turn to business and see what Vitor Grencho thinks. He's the manager, as you can see, of social sustainability at Philip Morris. Philip Morris. Tobacco. But then you're here, and I thank you for being here, and I've seen your agricultural labor practices program. At least here's a company that is striving to do the right thing with their supply chain. Tell us about, now that we've heard from the monitoring and watchdog on the role of business, Could you describe some of Philip Morris's initiatives in addressing labor issues, including forced labor, in this in the tobacco supply chain and the tobacco growing supply chain?
Sure, sure, absolutely. Thank you once again for inviting PMI to be part of this panel and to share our experience with such a distinct audience. We are trying to strive, that's for sure. At least we are trying really hard to actually have what Phil just mentioned, i.e. greater visibility into what's happening throughout our supply chain so we can act upon directly on issues. We are also trying to establish strong partnerships so we can address the most systemic issues we have in our supply chain. And as you showed, through public reporting, we are trying to be as transparent as possible to demonstrate the efforts that we are putting in place. Let me just very briefly, I know that we're focusing on solution, but let me just very briefly provide a bit of background in our tobacco growing supply chain. PMI sources from approximately 450,000 tobacco farms in nearly 30 countries. And most of these, the vast majority of these farms are small-scale family farms. So ranging from 0.5 hectares to 2 hectares. We do not own any farm, so we buy directly from farmers or suppliers. And the most important step for us in order to understand what's happening in our supply chain was actually to establish direct relationships with farmers. So cutting the middlemen and the poolers that actually hide most of the issues in supply chains. Unfortunately, poor labor practices are a reality in the whole agricultural sector. It's not specific to tobacco, not specific to any other commodity. And typically, migrants are more often than not, one of the most vulnerable populations. Many of the issues they face, again, are systemic, so companies cannot address those issues alone, by themselves. However, it's important to say that this should not and must not be an excuse for inaction. So we take these issues very seriously, and that's why we've put in place what we call our Global Agricultural Labor Practices Program, our ALP program, to address issues from child labor, forced labor, safety on farms, and other labor practices. We implement this program in the 450,000 farms worldwide, and we soon realized that when Human Rights Watch visited Kazakhstan and found issues of forced labor and child labor, we understood that we didn't have enough visibility. We didn't have the right systems in place to actually understand what was happening. Yes, we had a policy of no child labor. Yes, we had a no forced labor clause in the contracts with the farmers, but that was not enough. The issue was there. So that's why we understood that we really needed external support, expert support, and through the long-standing relationship with ICCR, the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, we engaged with Verite, a leading NGO in the field of supply chain responsibility. And they helped us implementing, or designing and implementing the ALP program, which consists of clear standards, an ALP code, as we called it, which was developed in consultation with ILO, with Human Rights Watch, with ICCR, again, among others, and established what we expect to be met on all contracted farms, from provisions related to child labor, to forced labor, safe work environment, income and work hours, fair treatment of workers, and freedom of association. So an holistic approach to our tobacco growing supply chain. But clearly standards are not enough. Standards just, as I said, I think set the expectations. We felt the need actually to have training programs for our suppliers, for our own affiliates, for farmers and workers, and for the field technicians that actually visit farms day in, day out to support farmers, improving the way they grow tobacco, and also monitor what's happening on the farm, i.e. issues. And this was critical because today we have 3,500 field technicians monitoring farms on a systematically basis, again, in nearly 30 countries, to actually try to identify risk, identify issues, prevent issues, and address issues. In addition to this internal monitoring system, we also have an external monitoring system. As Phil said, audits are not enough, are important, have a role to play, but are not enough. So we have external assessments by a third party that actually conducts country-specific assessments to evaluate the conditions on farms. And those assessments include an action plan by our suppliers and our affiliates with commitments on how to address the findings. Equally important, stakeholder engagement. And this was also something we put as a critical component of the program, because of the need of engaging with NGOs, governments, international organizations, and others to address the systemic issues, the issues that we cannot address by ourselves. In the context of forced labor, this approach is helping us gaining visibility, once again, understanding the risk factors of forced labor. And as we discussed earlier today, things like the use of crew leaders, where there's no visibility whatsoever in terms of the recruitment practices and the payment practices. Passport retention, withholding of documents, payments at the end of the crop season or the end of harvest. Also, sharecropping agreements, risk factors that can actually lead to situations of forced labor. And we, through the work of field technicians, we were able to have our affiliates and our suppliers discussing these topics, trying to come up with solutions, understanding what works best and what doesn't work. And this is a real challenge because forced labor is probably one of the issues that is more hidden in the supply chain. But this was really important to actually get people understanding what the issues were and how they can actually support farmers in improving practices to avoid risks of forced labor. I will just focus on a specific example that explains this approach very briefly, because we are focused on solutions. In Italy, for instance, our internal monitoring data and also our external assessment that was conducted in 2015 found some workers being brought to the farms through crew leaders, without the farmers having any visibility on the recruitment, how they were brought to the farm, who brought it, how, did they pay anything to get on the farm or not. And these were migrant workers coming from the north part of Africa to Italy, to the south, to the Campania region. So acknowledging these issues, our local affiliate took a number of steps to try to address those, including recently expanding a grievance mechanism to the south of Italy to try to understand whether the issues are there and what kind of issues can workers raise through that grievance mechanism, but also establishing a partnership with the IOM, so that we could understand a little bit better about the issue. And the partnership started with a preliminary assessment of the migrant needs in the south of Italy in two regions, Campania and Apulia. This was not sector specific. This was not specific to tobacco. It was focused on the needs of the migrants, and in two regions that actually have different sectors, agriculture, obviously, and also construction and other sectors. And through that partnership, IOM is now looking into potential solutions to help those migrants, including legal counseling and referral services, social services and health services, including education, language courses to help the integration of those migrants, and as part of those courses, providing information on asylum procedures, residence permits, workers' rights. So topics that are relevant for those migrants and that can actually support them in the transition. Also, job placement and vocational training, that's something that is being explored with the private sector, and accommodation and housing for the migrants living in ghettos and other informal settlements. So again, for us, it was really important to have the standards in place, strong partnerships, gaining a greater visibility into labor practices in our supply chain, and transparency. Because we believe that transparency is the catalyst to bring about change. And as Phil mentioned, sector-wide initiatives are important. I dream of the day where I see actually cross-sector initiatives addressing specific issues. We are starting to see some, but I would dream of the day that we have more of that and more companies involved in the discussion about this topic.
Thank you very much, Vitor. I just want to give you a quick time check. We started at 2:20. This session was supposed to run to 3:15, but I propose that it runs to 3:30 if our sponsors agree. And so that means we have about 32 minutes left. We have 2 more speakers, and we'd like to have an interactive discussion with the audience. Having said that, I would like to ask Frederick Muya. I'm leaving you till the last, Tatiana, don't worry. Frederick, you're the senior advisor for IOE, which is based here in Geneva, but it's one of the largest employer organizations in the world. Frederick is from Kenya, but I'm not going to go there at the moment, to be fair to you. And ask you, from the perspective, we've heard a single company talk about their experiences and how they're trying to improve practices. Yeah. And frankly, I'm really surprised that there are no more businesses here. I know 1 or 2 others were planning to come. Many others were invited, but there we are. No comment there. But from an umbrella organization, how do you see this problem being solved?
Yeah, thank you very much. At the risk of sounding like a policy wonk, I will focus on the work that we do from a much broader perspective than what Vitor has said from a company perspective. But for people to understand how we work, as you said, the IOE is actually the largest network of the private sector in the world. We are present in more than 160 countries, and we bring together national business federations. And this is very important for the kind of discussion that we are having now. It is a discussion that cannot be separated from the global migration debate. As employers, we say that migration presents opportunities for business to fill in skill gaps in the countries where they find themselves in. And of course, taking into account demographic challenges, as you do find in a number of countries. And so, as countries committed themselves during the adoption of 2030 development agenda, that they were going to work together to ensure safe and orderly migration, which means then you have to do it in such a way that you create more and regular avenues for people to be able to move. The challenge is when you adopt restrictive policies that do pose a challenge to business, then you create room for some of the unscrupulous people because they are able, to traffic persons because they feel that skills are needed in the country that has just adopted restrictive policies. And so what we say as employers is recognize the fact that we need to work together to maximize the opportunities of migration, but most importantly, to minimize the risks. So how do we do this at the level of the IOE? Just to inform participants that we've been asked by the Global Migration, the GFMD, Global Forum on Migration and Development, to create the business mechanism. What does the business mechanism seek to do? It is to bring the voice of business in the discussions that governments are holding in order to create more and better governance of migration. So this mechanism is located at the IOE, and I'm the person who is responsible for that. We are, of course, addressing skills mobility, as I've just mentioned, but increasingly the risks. The risks that we are addressing have to do with recruitment. Recruitment is the first entry point to migration, which means that we have to get it right from the beginning. It means that we need to work very closely with what we call labor recruiters so that we get it right. We make sure that you do away with what we call fraudulent and abusive recruitment practices. And how are we doing this at the level of the IOE? We've been working very closely with the ILO. The IOE is the voice of business in the ILO, and I see my counterparts from the ILO in the room, Beat and my friend over there. And very recently, we adopted what we call Fair Recruitment Practices document, Fair Recruitment Principles document. This document it's got about 12 principles. Many of the risks have been mentioned by my colleagues. I don't want to go through them, but it's about making sure, first and foremost, that, and we have an ILO policy document that's called the ILO Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. It's about freedom of association, right to collective bargaining, how to fight discrimination, issues to do with child labor and forced labor.
So you already have a handbook?
Yes, we have a handbook on that, on how to promote the Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. And right now we are working on a document on promotion of fair and ethical recruitment practices that takes into account the work that we are also working with the IOM and what we recently adopted with the ILO. So it is about now using the power of our network, coming back to what I was saying, because we are present in every country. Just this week I was in the Middle East, and some of the challenges we are talking about. The ILO has a program that they are calling Fair Migration in the Middle East. And of course, some of the dangers that we were talking about are there. I was recently having a chat with one of the largest IOE members in the UAE, and I visited 7 of his factories. And one of the things we were discussing is he's, as you know, UAE, Dubai, and all the other Emirates are seeking to be one of the most prestigious financial and business hub in the world. And what I was telling them is, imagine you seek to be the best, and if you do not address some of the risks we are talking about, then this is going to have a lot of reputational damage to the brand that you seek to build. And so it is one way of saying there are opportunities because you're able to, fill in the skills gaps in the countries, but you have to make sure that you address some of the inherent risks that are associated with, fraudulent recruitment of persons in their countries of origin.
And abusive practices.
Of course.
Did you give them the handbook?
Yes, I did.
Do you have much more to go? Because I'd like to give Tatiana
not
the floor.
really. Just to add on to the fact that codes of conduct were mentioned. At the IOE, as I said, we've been working with member federations, but increasingly we are working with companies. Companies can now become direct partners with the IOE. And my friend this year, the company became a partner of the IOE. So we want to use the power of the global brands such as Coca-Cola in order to influence others. As a matter of fact, the toolkit that we are developing has got best practices from some of these, top brands, so that we can share and we build coalitions.
How many companies do you have?
As partner companies, we have 44.
44.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's a good beginning.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Frederick. I'd like to now invite Tatiana to give us her perspective from Ukraine, the OSCE project in Ukraine, on the economic empowerment of persons at risk to trafficking and survivors of trafficking. Can you tell us a little more about it?
Sure. Before that, I would like briefly to mention that OEC is also dealing with the issue of human trafficking in supply chains. And just recently, under the auspices of the Special Representative for Combating Human Trafficking of the OEC and our German chairmanship, we've had a very promising event in Berlin. And as far as I've heard from my colleagues, we're having more events and more regional seminars to tackle this issue, particularly focusing not only on businesses, but also on public procurement, because you know that this is another kind of sphere which requires close attention whenever we're speaking about human trafficking as well. And also labor recruiters, this is also quite a burning issue, I would say, in many OEC participating states, and including in Ukraine, and we are trying to tackle this issue also through the dialogue with the government as well as with the respective businesses. Speaking about, our activities in terms of economic empowerment, why are we doing it? First of all, because it's very clear that it's not just businesses, part of a problem, part of the solution, but its economy per se is also kind of a push and pull factor whenever we're speaking about human trafficking. And its economic situation is very much jeopardized also whenever we're speaking about crisis situation. And Ukraine is a very clear example of that. But we also should be very open-minded and have a very thorough analysis for whom we are working whenever we are speaking about human trafficking and crisis situations. We were speaking a lot about, refugees and asylum seekers. For Ukraine, we, as our NGO representative mentioned, we are facing rather a problem of IDPs. 1.7 million of IDPs. And if you compare, the profiling of IDPs and refugees or asylum seekers, that's two completely different patterns. So if we're speaking about, for example, the data from the Eurostat with regard to the refugees and asylum seekers, we have 83% of them below 34. Yeah, so the age, they're young. Yeah, the majority of them are also men. We have 55%. Those of the older generation, over 65, it's less than 1%. Whenever we're looking at the IDPs profiling, situation is drastically different because we have 52% of elderly people. We have 4% of disabled, and we have only 30% of economically active population among the IDPs. And the majority of the IDPs are female, 61% of that. And of course, speaking about, the challenges IDPs are facing, unemployment is a huge one, because in comparison to, what is happening in the country overall, like the unemployment rate is 9%, for the IDPs it's 34%. So the figure is much, much higher, and this is a really big challenge for people, which make them much more vulnerable for human trafficking and for deceit and risky offers. And that's why we also, when looking into the profiling of our at-risk group for human trafficking, we were also, very cautious about how to work with them, how to approach this unemployment issue. Because quite an obvious solution proposed by many, including the humanitarian actors, let's get these people into businesses. Yeah, let's train them, let's get them some money, and let's, help them to start businesses. Unfortunately, very few of them have any kind of inclination to do their own businesses. So the majority of those unemployed, they were mostly wage and salary workers, so they are not business people and they don't really feel like going into businesses. So that's why whenever we were, thinking about our potential interventions, we were thinking about doing economic empowerment for them in a slightly different manner, meaning opening social businesses as affiliates to the anti-trafficking NGOs. I know this is a pretty innovative thing whenever we're speaking about, anti-trafficking agenda, Not so many NGOs, including in Ukraine, are really open, to the idea of having a social business as an affiliate, any kind of business, particularly social, because they're not very sure how it will work out, and they're not business people themselves. But the ideas seem to be very promising. We're working for a year now. We have 2 already social businesses on the run. Of course, it took us a lot of efforts to help the NGOs to develop their business plans, to train them, to help them with the very basic things, like registration of the businesses and how to do the accounting correctly. But it works. So we have the social businesses working, we have the beneficiaries who are receiving job skills in these businesses, and these are mostly former victims of trafficking, because re-trafficking is also quite a problem, and we have a certain percentage of victims globally who are re-trafficked, because whenever they are reintegrated, they still face a lack of economic opportunities, and they still, submit themselves to those risky offers and go again. Also partially thinking that, well, now I know what I'm doing. So to work with the victims, we have 8% among our beneficiaries of those former victims of trafficking. We have almost 20% of IDPs as part of our beneficiaries. And we have other categories at risk of human trafficking, with the majority of them, of course, being women, because, as I said, the majority of those influenced by conflict are women. At the same time, men, they're also very, very proactive whenever it comes to, to the idea of social business. Particularly, I was very, emotionally struck by one appeal of one of the IDPs, who was relocated from the eastern Ukraine to the western Ukraine and found his skills completely inappropriate, because he was coming from a heavily industrial region to a region which has not so much of industry, more of agriculture and other types of activities. So, and he was kind of very eager, to learn and develop and change his skills to be, to be really reintegrated or integrated into the new labor market. So he said, I don't want, myself to be seen as a problem for this local community, for the country. I want myself to be seen as a resource. So I'm eager to invest my own time, my own money, but to become a resource for the country. And I think this is a message which comes from many, many migrants, whether we're speaking about internal or external migration in this regard. So my kind of, basic appeal to all of us is to really be well-informed whom we're trying to help, and try to really make very tailored interventions whenever we're speaking about anti-trafficking agenda, and really try to take into account this very, very, for us maybe minor details, but for people, these are the things which can abruptly change their lives for good or for bad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Well, you've heard it all, and just counting the number of experts on each panel, we have more in this panel than in the 2 previous panels. So that shows you how important we think the inclusion of corporations and of civil society is in struggling to deal with this problem. The floor is open. We have 15 minutes. We, as I said before, welcome questions and comments. If you have a comment, please make it brief, and I hope it's a recommendation to improve the ways we tackle. I'll start with people who haven't asked questions before. I have a gentleman there in the back. Do we have microphones, roving microphones? And the gentleman in the 4th row here. All right, well, we'll start with him until the microphone gets to you, sir. Go ahead, please introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and what's on your mind.
Mr. Fevzi, thank you very much for giving the floor. In fact, I didn't have the intention of asking a question. I am the permanent representative of the Council of Europe. And with your indulgence, may I have an announcement regarding the very issue we are talking, and also the general business and human rights issue. In fact,
as long as it's brief, sir.
very brief. Next June, this June, Council of Europe is going to organize its first big international forum on business and human rights, including this issue we are tackling. And I wish, first, I am addressing myself to our dear panelists, to the audience. Anyone, any stakeholder related to business, human rights, migration issues, they will be very much welcome. They can get the information either through our office in Geneva or directly from our secretariat in Strasbourg. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sir, you have a microphone.
Yes, hi. Brian from slavefreetrade.org. Again, the newest NGO in the room, I think. So my question to you is, this is the most relevant panel, of course, for what I'm trying to do with slave-free trade. We're trying to create a slave-free product labeling regime. Very interested to hear what the panel had to say. I didn't hear much about mobilizing the consumer population to get businesses to focus more on their supply chains. There was mention of governments and regulation and self-regulation, not a lot about the consumer. Would the panel like to mention something about how to mobilize consumers better to get businesses to really focus on the issue?
How to mobilize consumers better. Phil, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, briefly. I think Nick's already really shown the vital importance of the media and the way in which there's now a real effort by a good number of reputable media sources to bring out the phenomenal loss of human dignity and freedom that's involved in slavery and the way it's in supply chains. I think the second thing is that we need to have the evidence, and that means the kind of benchmark. We need the mandatory transparency, first of all, that we were speaking about, but then that's got to be organised into a form of registry so people can customize and find the information that they need regarding whether the companies are making sufficient effort or not to exclude. And so, you know, the benchmarks, for instance, that we run, they're focused particularly on really three key audiences. The first is investors, because they're the owners of capital. They need to be able to say to the companies, we will not tolerate this lack of due diligence. You've got massive reputation risk in your supply chains. The second is talent, because a lot of companies need to attract the best talent, and they know that's one of the most important features of their sustainability as a business. And talent wants to work for companies that at least express some of their human values. They do not want to work for companies that have some of the most vile human suffering in their supply chains. And the third audience is consumers. At the moment, I think consumers are not properly served, even by the benchmarks that we've got, because you need a quite different approach to reaching out to consumers. But I think that will come in time.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to add anything? Nick, you look like you're prepared to say something.
I think it's important not to put too much of the burden on consumers too. I mean, I think as an activist who strongly believes in the power of mobilizing people, the response to slavery shouldn't be it's the consumer's job to work out which products are clean or not clean, because first of all, that information doesn't exist yet. Second of all, consumers are often making choices on other indicators. I think that where consumers get involved is where there is a scandal or, I think, for instance, if you're in the prawn importation business in the US, you have to be very, very careful that, in fact, you won't have such a push against stories of exploitation and slavery in the supply chain that you will see a falling off of the market. But, that's different to saying consumers have to make a choice at every level. On the label issue, look, in an ideal world, labels are wonderful. But if we don't have the basic information from companies about their supply chains, you can't build a good label. So I see these as the building blocks to establishing a powerful label, but that's going to be a long, long way down. If someone says now that they can put a label on something and it's slave-free, I just won't believe it, unless they're purchasing directly from the producer and have really, really rigorous procedures and practices in place. But that's where we have to head.
Thank you very much. The lady here in the third row first, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and congratulations. It was a great panel. I have one question. Well, again, I'm Adriana Ruiz Restrepo. I work in the
Bogota.
Global South. No, I am from Cali in Colombia, but I
okay.
work in the Global South mainly. And I really congratulate you because sometimes you just hear about the reputation and the marketing and not the real things. My first question is, how can we share evidence with the headquarters? Because when you share it with the local benchmarking, well, usually they're really good friends of the mayor or of the president, or, you know, so it's very important when you fight corruption to take evidence up and far from the part, from the place of the problem. And the second would be a suggestion, and this is to put your focus on the rule of law in developing countries, because the rule of law is sometimes undermined by publicity, massive publicity. So we win a case, a huge case regarding waste pickers in waste management, who are used to provide cheap commodities through cheap labor to big supply chains. And as soon as you win the case and you start to implement the cases by the immediately publicity. We're doing great, we're awesome, they gave prizes every day, I give you a prize, you give me a prize. And then the idea is that everything's right and you're a crazy human rights defender. So it would be very important to find a way to share the evidence with the headquarters or with the benchmark so we can share that. And the other one, to create indicators with regard to the respect of the rule of law, particularly of social business, solidarity economy, and the enterprises of people in poverty. They have been completely captured in their social enterprises because they need to triangle the provision. And we just don't know how to share that. So any advice, and if you could please include the rule of law in developing countries in your benchmarks, that would be really great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you give this lovely lady the microphone? Why don't you ask your question first before we get a reaction from the panel?
Well, yeah, a little question. What it is that recently I have met, my name is Michelle Mildwater from Hope Now in Denmark. We meet a lot of people who have been displaced from Syria and all over the world. Recently I met a woman who had a wonderful business in Damascus with tailoring and everything, a very big organization. The whole of her business was bombed. She ended up a victim in Denmark and ending up halfway in Sweden. She was actually in prison when I met her because she'd unfortunately moved over the border without realizing. This was a woman with great business capacity. How can you use people who are really, in fact, very good at making business so that we can make survivors and business people out of previous victims?
Thank you. Thank you. Shall we deal with the first question first? Anyone from the panel want to deal with that comment? Let's go to you, Frederick, first, and then Nick.
Yeah, just to respond to the last question, we recently had a discussion in the ILO based on the ongoing discussion to do with coming up with a global compact to address the plight of refugees. And the question was, how can we, as people who represent the world of work, meaning employers, trade unions, and governments, do something when it comes to addressing the access of refugees to the labor market? And this is a question of refugees, as you said, this woman had her own dignity, she had a business, and usually when they go to the country of refuge, they don't want to be seen as a burden. You know, they don't want to be living from handouts. They want to use their skills, their experience, their expertise to be able to earn their living and support their families. So the question, obviously governments have a role to decide whether they are going to be given asylum, but once they've been given asylum, it's very important that you identify their skills and support them in terms of, you know, usually a refugee who once granted asylum would live in the country of refuge for more than 25 years. So meaning during that time, you can really, you know, use their skills, their expertise, and more importantly, if this person has got entrepreneurial skills, as is the case, this person can actually contribute to the economic and social development of the country that has accepted her.
I I'll respond to the first question, which I'll interpret as how do you really know what's going on the ground, what's happening at the ground in terms of implementing decisions and whether the public pronouncements are being matched with real action at the ground level. And our response is one key approach, certainly from my organisation's perspective, is to work with local groups, all right, local community groups on the ground, with local organisations, local trade unions. So we work, for instance, in Thailand, where we're working with about 8 migrant organisations, local organisations, and huge pressure in Thailand to clean up the fishing industry, and billion-dollar corporations saying we've got these plans of actions, we've got our policies, we've got our statements, and a lot of good work is happening. But you can very quickly get a sense of what's really happening by talking to the groups that represent the Cambodian and Myanmar workers who are coming off the boats or being tricked onto the boats to see whether or not contracts are in place and whether or not proper procedures are in place. So a key, not a sole component, is working with these local community organisations who have access to this information and feeding it up.
Thank you very much, Nick. We really have 2 minutes to go before the closing session, which is already delayed by 15 minutes, and I know Phil wants to add. Do you want to add something very briefly?
Well,
no, you said add it to the list of things, and that's noted and well taken, right?
It is. But just very quickly, the issue of sharing this evidence with HQ is critical. So much of local management is effectively given incentives by the headquarters to essentially say all their incentives are about maximising profit. They carry that out to the letter, which leads to the abuse that happens further down. We take 400 allegations of abuse up every year with the international headquarters of the companies where these abuses are being reported from the local situation. Quite often, the international HQ has no idea, and when they hear about it, they're appalled and say, oh, God, we better, But the issue is the incentives that are being passed down to the local management have to be changed. If all your procurement officers are told, maximise get the lowest price possible, that's what your wages will depend on, that's what they'll do, and that's what leads to the abuse. So it's got to be changed, that effort, but we've got to start taking those things up. Finally, human rights defenders are absolutely critical to this. They are, at the local level, people who are increasingly at risk because of the narrowing of civic freedoms. It's these people that are being criminalised, intimidated, and assassinated for what they're doing. So actually ensuring that we've got proper defence of the human rights defenders and the whistleblowers is fundamental.
Thank you very much, Phil. Very much. Thank you very much. And since this is a business panel, last word from business. Go ahead, Vito.
Thank you. I know that we are short of time, so very briefly try to answer the second question. I think that's very relevant. As part of our ALP program, we also provide support through community programs. We partnered with more than 30 NGOs currently, and some of the programs are actually trying to tackle that, i.e. trying to understand what the needs are on the ground and whether there's any opportunities to provide support, economic opportunity through entrepreneurial programs. So it's really critical to understand what the needs are on the ground so that we can try to put in place with strong partnerships, programs that can actually improve the livelihoods of the community.
Thank you very much, Vitor. That concludes this session on business. I'd like to thank Phil, Nick, Vitor, Frederic, and Tetiana for your insights. I think this was one of the most efficient panels, don't you? Where we had sort of can-do action points. I know we're all dying for a summary of where we are, but let's go to the closing session. And I'd like to invite Beaty Andres from ILO. She's the Chief Fundamental Principles and Rights at the work branch of ILO, to start our closing session with her remarks from the lectern, please. Thank you very much, Tetiana and gentlemen. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Fadi, and good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. That was a great day. I think a very rich feast of presentations we've just enjoyed. And I will not even dare to summarize everything that was discussed today, but just want to highlight a few points that struck me in particular. First of all, let me start with a warm thank you to our host, the Swiss government, in particular the Federal Department for Foreign Affairs. We have been working with the Swiss government actually for a number of years and organized these, or helped to co-organize these Geneva-based events. So I think it's yet another example of your leadership, bringing UN-based organizations together here in Geneva. And I'd like to thank IM, UNHCR, and OHCHR for partnering with us. But of course also DCAF and OC, that was a very interesting part of the event today. So thank you also to the panelists for sharing their experiences and for being so open in discussing also difficult questions. I think we can also agree that this was a very timely event, with crisis looming everywhere, large-scale refugee flows, migration all over in the world, labor mobility increasing, which in itself is actually not a bad thing, but comes with certain risks. And there's not a single day that goes by without reports focusing on forced labor or child labor in various industries across the globe. And this is certainly a sign of greater awareness of the problem, but it's also a sign that something is fundamentally wrong. And all of these reports come with individual human tragedies. And I'd like to take up the word you said, Mr. Fazi, in the morning. And you said, for want of a better word, I think actually it is the right word to say, human decency. Let us never forget that when we work on this issue, it is linked to bigger policy issues like migration policies, like the rule of law, and so on, that we maintain our human decency and that we treat all of those at risk with human decency. And certainly we've only scratched the surface of what we would call the root causes of those problems. The breakdown of good governance in many countries, the global integration of economies, again, in itself positive, but creating many challenges as well as opportunities which we need to tackle. And just the last panel, I think this focus on transparency in global supply chain is certainly an interesting aspect which will stay with us for years to come. And then many of the speakers also called for innovation. And in fact, the title of the event was New Ways to Address Human Trafficking. And I think here, having been in this space for a long time, I think we all need to recognize that innovation doesn't just fall from the sky. It's not just coming along our way. Innovation appears when people get together that actually have very different perspectives on a problem. And we need to take time to listen to each other. We need to have a space where each of us feels comfortable enough to share experiences, even painful ones or even difficult experiences. And I think the event today was a very good example of such a dialogue, which really involves partners from very different walks of life. All of them have something to contribute. And we've heard a lot about new guidelines, methods, tools, standards. Really, there is progress. When we look back since 2000, when the Palermo Protocol was adopted, I think a major milestone, there is really progress. We have seen a major change in terms of awareness, but also in terms of solutions. And what we are proposing, and I'd like to come back to what our Deputy Director General said in the morning, is to take this forward in a global way, link it more systematically to the new sustainable development guidelines, the new framework that was adopted in 2015, and set up a global alliance linked to, in particular, Target 8.7 that covers all of these issues, and create space for this innovative dialogue to continue with a view to find practical solutions which we can share, which we can implement in various countries across the ground. So we will continue this discussion, and I'd like really to thank once again the government of Switzerland for hosting us here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Beate. as you said, I wouldn't even dare summarize what's happened here today, but there were so many good ideas and good statements and good promises. But I'm sure that that our friend and colleague from DCAF, Stella Haxey, might have something to say about that at the end, in summary. But now I would like again to invite our sponsor, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or rather the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, Minister Raphael Nageli, to say a few words in this closing session. And thank you for staying all day with us.
Thank you. It was worse. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It was a long day. At the same time, it was also a very short day. It was long because we heard a wealth of discussions. We heard different perspectives on one common problem. We heard many known positions, but we also heard some new ideas. I mean, the ambition was to find new ways to tackle forced the new ways to tackle migration and new ways to tackle human trafficking. We heard that repressive measures do not work. We heard that we should address the root causes. We heard that resettlement and relocation quite often works well. We heard that we should open labor markets, and we should offer education possibilities. We also heard that incentives for regional and circular migration actually could make a difference. We heard many more things, but frankly, not all of these ideas were new. And if my naive hope this morning was that we would actually find new ways, that we would jointly develop and detect the magic formula to solve all the problems of this world, then this naive hope has not been implemented. But I think that's as far as we can go today. We heard best practices of how to identify victims, of how to mitigate vulnerability of minors. We heard how to proactively involve businesses, and that's very much as far as we can go today. Ideas, to be honest, ideas are there. Old ideas, which are still good, and a couple of new ideas. We do not suffer from a lack of ideas. Where we do suffer from is from a lack of implementation of these ideas. So there is an obvious gap between principles and realities, and there is a gap between the ideas and their implementation. And what we lack mostly is the political will to bridge that gap, to reduce that gap. If we want to build on a political will to reduce at least a part of this gap on a part of the issues, then we definitely need a proactive and a vibrant civil society. We definitely need competent and effective international organizations. We need the very competent special rapporteurs. And definitely we need proactive business communities that have a look at their supply chains, that have a look at competitive market mechanisms that will benefit the good ones. So I think there are a couple of things which we can address with all the ideas we have already now on the table. Now, before I let all of you go home, let me focus on two items of follow-up processes, two important political processes. Both of them have been mentioned today. First, the OSCE is in the process of updating the National Referral Mechanism Handbook, which provides guidance on how to design and how to implement sustainable mechanisms and structures to combat human trafficking and to support victims. The publication of the updated handbook will make sure new mechanisms are adapted to the present situation. Switzerland closely collaborates with the OSCE and its partners in this process and strongly encourages all the OSCE participating states to do so. There's a second process, and it has been said a couple of times today. The forthcoming negotiations on the Global Compact on safe, orderly and regular migration represents an opportunity to make today's response to human trafficking more efficient and better adapted to the current situation. Again, Switzerland invites all the relevant actors to take an active part in these negotiations. To conclude with, let me thank our co-organizers, DCAF and Maison de la Paix, as well as the OSCE, for the valuable contribution and for our decades of good cooperation, and I hope that this will continue in the future. Our warm thanks go also to all the other partners, to the ILO, to the IOM, to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and last but not least to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thanks a lot. You made this conference a success. Now I think all is said. All that remains is to wish you a safe trip home. Bon voyage, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. And to conclude, it gives me great pleasure to introduce from DCAF, Mrs. Stella Haxey, Head of the Program on Migration, Asylum and Counter-Trafficking, to close the conference.
On behalf of DCAF, we thank you all for being here. We are grateful to have had the opportunity to support OSCE during the closed consultation meeting, and also to support the FDFA and all the partner organizations in organizing the high-level event. In line with our mandate focused on democracy, good governance, and rule of law, we will continue to support the process. It's very important for us, and the summary of the conclusions will be presented later on as soon as possible after the meeting, and we'll reintegrate all the discussions, questions, reflections, because I think it was extremely rich in discussions, in thoughts, and we'll discuss about the format that this summary of conclusions will have. We thank you all once again for your interest, and a special thank to the team who worked with me. Everyone said you have been alone. No, I was not alone. I would like to thank Hutan from ILO, Sarah Elliott from UNHCR, Yula, Federica Donati, and Selma from the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, the great team of Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, Human Security Division, Carmela, Christina, and Mikael, and a special thank to my project officer, Juha-Pekka Iapula. You have seen the name everywhere, and also to our assistant, Laurence Durik, who was dealing with strike, Lufthansa strike. Thank you very much, and we hope to continue the discussion, and DCAF will be here to support you for other discussions. Thank you very much.